We can start. So, dear everyone, dear students, let me welcome here our guest, Arielle Bailey, who is a writer and an editor. She's from USA, and besides being an editor and being a witness or the first reader of many new stories of emerging authors and writers, she also published her first book this year. It was sometimes in the summer, if I'm correct, or even earlier, which is called the Icarus Aftermath. And it's basically about, or it's a combination of a sci-fi which is inspired by ancient Roman and Greek mythology, as far as I know. Okay. So can you introduce your book a little bit to our students?
First of all, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me. My book is, it's like if Star Wars was about Greek gods and goddesses instead of the Skywalkers. It's empires and people abusing their powers like you would find in fantasy, except it's science fiction, and a rebellion that's trying to stop them, and a family of kids who adopted each other, except now they're grown up and just making trouble for the empires.
Yeah, so I hope that sounds interesting for our students and that they may be motivated to have a look at your book or maybe purchase it later on. I actually started reading your book, as I mentioned to you before. I got about through the first 20% of the book. And since the topic of our colloquium this year is women and literature or women in literature, this talk will be focused mainly on the female characters. And I've noticed that in your book, there is about the equal number of the female and male characters. And so do women play important role in your book?
They do. I'm a firm believer in equality.
Mm-hmm.
So I like writing that. I like writing men and women without a gender divide. We have a gender divide in our world, but because I write fantasy, I get to write books that show what a world might be like without a gender divide. So a lot of the books that I write, the advancement of characters isn't based on their gender. Mm-hmm. There are some things that are gender specific, like the main female character in my novel is an Amazon. Traditionally, Amazons are an all-female warrior society. But in this retelling, that isn't necessarily because they hate men. It's just like, well, sometimes you have a boys' club, sometimes you have a girls' club, sometimes you have a mixed club.
Yeah.
It isn't necessarily because of a gender divide.
Yes, so that's interesting. Mm-hmm. What inspired you to write this kind of mixture of the mythology with fantasy, with sci-fi?
I like to say that 95% of my writing inspiration comes from frustration. I will watch a television show and I will be intensely frustrated because the concept was fantastic. The execution was just frustrating. Very much lacking. I can read a book series and have the same reaction, and probably 80% of the movies I watch gives me that reaction of, hey, you had a great concept there, but the execution was somewhat lacking. Part of that is because I'm an editor. Part of it is because, let's be honest, Hollywood is not the greatest storyteller. It's just not.
Yes, that's often that they take concepts which are promising, but because of the budget limitations or whatever other reasons, in the end, it's quite rushed. The story happens to be quite rushed and not that well developed as it would deserve. And you reminded me, since my thesis is focused on Tolkien, it reminded me of him and Lewis. When they argued that there are not enough books they would like to read, so they decided to write ones for themselves.
My writing partner and I joke that we are Tolkien and Lewis.
A female version.
Yes, exactly.
So let's hope that your novel will be as famous in the future as Tolkien's.
That would be a great honor.
Yes.
a great honor. I've loved... The other 5% of my writing inspiration comes from why hasn't anyone done this before? Like, I think of a concept and I'm like, I go searching for a book or a movie or a television show based on that concept, and I don't find anything. And I'm like, wait a minute, this is a good concept. Why hasn't anyone done this before? And then I sit down and write it. And that's basically where this came from. I've loved Greek mythology since I was a kid. Incidentally, I didn't like the Icarus myth. I thought he was an idiot. I mean, it is a story about the dangers of hubris, right? So, but then one day, a little over a year ago, I'd had a really rough day. My horse had died. My family was still settling in from a big move. I was working really long hours. I was just tired. And then I got the news that my horse had died, and it was just a really long day. And I went to shower, and I was like, what if Icarus didn't fall into the sea? What if he didn't fly too close to the sun because he was arrogant, but because he was trying to save someone else, an entire fleet of people perhaps? And I thought, surely somebody's done that before. And I went looking, and the only Greek mythology science fiction stories that I could find were all more science fiction instead of science fantasy. So the difference being that science fiction is focused on technology and science fantasy blends elements of fantasy. Star Wars is technically science fantasy because you have the fantasy tropes of the chosen one and the swords and all of that kind of thing, the magic powers, mixed with the technology of science fiction. So I scribbled out a scene and I sent it to my writing partner, and she's like, no, this is good. And then I forgot about it. I was like, oh, whatever. That was fun. And then a couple months later, it was time for National Novel Writing Month, and I didn't really have a novel to write. So I pulled that out, and I whipped together a basic plot, and I wrote it, and I wrote 115,000 words in 33 days, which is a new record for me. Oh. I'm not normally quite that fast. And it just took off. I didn't know anyone who had combined mythology and space fiction in that particular style before, and it just worked.
Yeah, someone has to be the pioneer in the field. Maybe you're setting a new trend in the genre, and it's great that you were so inspired that it went so fast. So it's all great amount to write in so short a time. And besides of that, how was the process of like maybe publishing or getting the book into publishing once you finished it? Did you have any difficulties with that, or what was the process for you? I believe that you published it as a self-publishing.
Yes, I did.
So it might be much more difficult than publishing through any big established companies.
I think so, but it also had some unique advantages. I think as far as the process of a first book, I actually had it pretty easy because I've worked in the indie publishing world, which is what we call self-publishing, for 3 years now, I think, 3 or 4 years. So I've had a lot of experience with authors who have been self-publishing, and I have a lot of connections in that world now. So in some ways, it actually wasn't too bad for me. Revisions took about 5 months, which was a little longer than I had thought they would, but I gave myself a lot of time because I knew that I wanted to take things more slowly, and I wanted to give myself time to really feel out what I was doing. And it really worked out well. There were some late nights as I figured out what I needed to cut, what I needed to highlight more, just that kind of revising. But after that, it really went pretty easy. It's one of the cleanest first drafts I've ever written, which was kind of amazing considering how fast it came together. But then after that, usually it costs somewhere in the range of $1,000 to self-publish a book. And my costs were way lower, mostly because I have a great team of people behind me all of whom, incidentally, are female, all of whom are also authors. So my cover artist is my best friend and writing partner, and we swapped services. So she'll do my covers, I'll do her editing. Mm-hmm. My formatter is another client turned friend, and we swap. I edit her books, she formats mine and does the typography on my cover, and it's fantastic. And my proofreader / editor is another really good friend who is usually willing to swap a service like that too. So my initial publishing costs were a lot lower than most people, for which I'm incredibly grateful. And I also get to say, you know what? I have this fantastic team of people behind me, all of whom are women who are just kicking it in the self-publishing world. They're fantastic authors. They're great people. So I would say I had a very, very good self-publishing experience. And one of the advantages to doing it self-publishing instead of traditional publishing is that I didn't have to wait. Mm-hmm. Traditionally, if you sign with a trad publisher, you might be waiting 2 or 3 years for your book to come out. Also, they're in charge of cover design. You don't necessarily get a say. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. They're in charge of all the release details, when it comes out, where it gets promoted, how it gets promoted, and they're in charge of saying you can write, you can leave this content in for our press, you can't leave this in, you have to change this. With self-publishing, I don't have to deal with any of that. I get to say when my book is published, where it's promoted, how quickly. It would never have been out this quickly if I'd have signed with a traditional publisher. Mm-hmm. I get to be in charge of cover design, which is great because, I mean, I like getting to decide, no, that cover fits my book best, not what a publisher thinks is going to sell my book. So I would say I had a very positive self-publishing experience.
As far as the editing process is discussed, are there any passages that you had to maybe rewrite or leave out of the book that you regret? Or
not really regret. There was one that I took out that was supposed to be sort of a sword dance death ritual that I wish I'd been able to keep in, mm-hmm. but it'll probably come into a later book some way, somehow be repurposed for that. I wasn't able to really go into the political background of the mm-hmm. war in the first book, but that didn't really bother me because I got to ease people in by focusing on the rebellion and these characters at the heart of the rebellion. And then in this next book that I'm writing right now, I'm writing book 2 this month, I get to talk about the political background more, and in the next 2 books as well, and just explain that more and show people why the rebellion is so passionate. Yes. And I think that's actually easier on readers than giving it to them all at once.
Yes, of course. Now, sorry for always making the parallels with Tolkien. That's the problem many people have with his book, that he presents all this history at the beginning and they are bored with it. So you chose to keep your readers attracted.
Yes.
That's a good way. As a woman or female writer publishing, do you think there are any greater struggles awaiting women in this field than maybe men encounter?
I would say that depends on some different factors. In traditional publishing, yes, depending mm-hmm. on what field you're trying to publish in. For example, women actually do better in certain fields of traditional publishing. If you look at the bestseller list in YA fantasy, 90% of it is women, at least 90%. Women traditionally, or women have become the major producers of YA fantasy fiction. Also, romance fiction. Any romance genre, you look at the top books being published, and the majority of them are written by women. There are men who, when they try to write romance, they will publish under a female pen name because there is a stigma against men writing romance mm-hmm. in the traditional publishing world. In the same vein, In the areas of science fiction and crime/thriller and epic fantasy, it is harder for women. Some of them will publish under a male pseudonym because there is this perception among a lot of the audience that those books are just written by men. But that's the traditional publishing world. Mm-hmm. In self-publishing, it's actually a lot easier. Because, and this is the funny thing, women were at the forefront of a lot of self-publishing movements. They've been at the forefront of so much of it just because a lot of them, they're the ones who traditionally work from home, right?
Yeah.
So as self-publishing became more and more of a thing with Amazon making it possible to earn money with self-publishing and with writing to market popular genres such as romance and urban fantasy and stuff like that, women were the ones who said, wait, we see an opportunity, we're going to take it. So in that regard, there are a lot of self-publishing fields that are dominated by women. And even in some of the genres in self-publishing and in indie publishing that in traditional publishing would primarily be dominated by men, in indie publishing, the divide is a lot closer. So it's a lot more equal, or they're dominated by women. For example, epic fantasy. In the traditional publishing world, men publish more epic fantasy than women do. Think Brandon Sanderson, Patrick Rothfuss, Guy Gavriel Kay. I mean, the list goes on and on and on, starting with Tolkien and Lewis. Mm-hmm. In self-publishing, you find a lot more women because they said, well, hey, our epic fantasy isn't really getting sold in traditional publishing, so we'll indie publish it. So you find a lot more women in indie publishing. Mm-hmm. So I never really felt like any part of the process was harder for me as a woman. If I had been traditionally published, that experience may have been different because science fiction as a genre tends to be dominated by male writers. Timothy Zahn, David Weber, Eric Flint. Those are just some of the main space opera names in traditional publishing. And had I traditionally published, I may have found the experience a bit different. But in indie publishing, no, I didn't find any part of it harder. In fact, I would have say that I probably found some of it easier just because of the support base I had and all of the people who said, hey, tell me when you're ready and I will give you whatever help I can, whatever advice I can because of the connections I made.
That partially answers or almost fully answers the other question I was planning to ask, because I read many articles that in the traditional publishing, women, they struggle to be read and to be sold. There was one author who was writing quite a complaint on her blog that she has trouble to be sold, to become more famous, because all the foremost positions in bookshops, they are occupied by the traditional writers like Tolkien, Lewis, Martin, and whoever else. And there is not enough space for the emerging writers, and especially for women. So basically you answered that the reason is that it's the problem of the tradition. Maybe even the publishing houses prefer men over women in this field. And another thing is the marketing, that most of these traditional writers, the classic writers like Tolkien, Lewis, and Martin, they are nowadays promoted because of the films, because the film industry is turning their books into films, which is something similar that happened to the writer of Hunger Games stories. They became much more famous after the books were filmed.
Yes. And always, 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 traditional publishing companies are going to make their choices based on what they think sells, which is why we have so many gluts in the market. So somebody publishes something and it's popular and everybody else starts writing things similar to that because the publishing companies say, this is what's popular, this is the kind of thing we want to publish because we know it sells. Their decisions are based so much on what sells, they're not usually willing to take a risk either on a different gender of writer in a certain field or on something that's just different. That is a giant advantage that indie publishing has because we get to take risks. We get to say, hey, this is space opera that's science fantasy instead of science fiction. This is Greek gods and goddesses in space. And we get to put that out, publish it. I mean, try to make it good, of course, first. And we get to put that out, whereas many traditional companies wouldn't necessarily sign that because it isn't like things that have been published before. They can't know that it's going to sell. And that is probably the biggest downside, I would say, to traditional publishing. And the thing that frustrates me most as an editor is that they just don't take risks. Instead, they artificially shape the market because this one thing is popular, so then they just decide we're going to publish things like this. And then they're not really taking risks. They're not really trying anything else. And then that even starts to affect the indie publishing world, because then some people in the indie publishing world are like, oh, if I want to sell, I have to write something like that. No, you don't. You just have to know how to market what you're writing so that it finds the people who are going to want to read it.
Yes. Similar like to Harry Potter series, the writer Rowling, she has been refused for so many times until she found a publisher willing to publish and risk it and to publish her story. As far as your publishing, have you been surprised by how well it sells, or does it have success?
Well, it's not as much of a success yet because I haven't put a lot of time into marketing. I've had a crazy year like most people, and I just haven't spent a lot of time marketing it, but I have been thrilled and surprised with the reaction it's gotten from the few readers it has had so far, with people saying why they loved it. And it's non-traditional in a sense, because in a lot of senses, but in one way, because so much of it dealt with grief and picking up the pieces after this basically intergalactic hero died. And that's not the usual tone for a space opera book or a science fantasy book. It's more about adventure. And this tended to blend the adventure with that. And so I wasn't really sure it would take off or that people would like that because there wasn't as much adventure. It was more a combination of adventure and psychology, that emotional journey, basically. So it was much more emotional and cerebral in some parts. And instead, everybody who's read it so far has said, no, we love that about it. But movies and TV shows just don't spend enough time dealing with actual grief. They're like, oh, well, that person died. We're going to spend one episode mourning them, and then it's all in the past. And that's not how real life works. Hate to break it to you.
In one way, maybe it may have become more relevant in the events of the recent year, like the COVID and the threat of deaths and everything. So people are reconsidering maybe the purpose of their life, and they try to find some consolation in literature. And another way, maybe that's just what you said, that it is a different take on the topic, which the traditional market hasn't yet tried to do or try to approach. So maybe that's why the readers who are fed up with the marketing way, they were just looking for some change, maybe. So it can help it. Okay, in your opinion, what does make a successful writer or a successful female writer?
Writing books that are engaging to your reader, especially if you have a reader who doesn't normally read that genre or that style of book, and they pick it up and they stick with it, and then at the end they say, I liked this. I would say that is probably the highest mark of success that any writer can achieve. That was one of my favorite reviews actually on my book, was when a girl I had worked with before in editing, she was a client, and she read it and she said, I don't normally read science fiction or science fantasy, or it's just not my thing, but I loved this book. Now I would say that's probably the highest mark of success that any writer can achieve, is writing a story so engaging that people who don't normally read that kind of thing read it and love it. On a more practical plane, I would say just having repeat readers, people who who love what you write, but who find meaning in what you write as well. Something personal for them. And it doesn't have to be something super deep or super cerebral. Just it means something to them as a person. And they keep coming back to that. So I would say that's the mark of one. And that's true of male and female writers. Mm-hmm.
My idea is that maybe to write something that you yourself like, as you did, that something that you miss in the market field, and it will somehow find its readers, find the people who are on the same maybe spiritual level, like soulmates who are seeking this exact kind of literature.
Yes.
Okay. And what about a good feminist story or feminine story?
This is one of my favorite topics, and I might get a little long in the answer here.
Hey.
My opinion, what makes a successful feminine or feminist or female story really comes back to equality. I talk about this a lot in regards to Star Wars, specifically the original trilogy, but I'll go into it just a little bit. Mm-hmm. Be warned, if you haven't seen Star Wars, there are going to be spoilers. So in the first movie, the one that came out in 1977, which we now call A New Hope, you see men and women equally holding positions of importance within the story. The princess in the story starts the story out with a gun. She's firing at the enemy. She's hiding information. She's obviously important, but not because she's a princess. She's important because of what she's doing, which is something that not many stories had done, at least on the big screen, up until that point. Leia is immediately at the center of the action. She might just be the only girl in a movie with 3 or 4 other guys or whatever, for the most part, but she's important, and not because she's a woman. She's important because of what she's doing. And even as a prisoner, after she's taken prisoner and after she's being interrogated and everything, she retains her personality. She retains her autonomy. And when she's rescued, and I love this, when she's rescued, she doesn't behave like the typical princess being rescued kind of a thing. You don't even think, oh, the prince is here to rescue the princess. Well, at least I didn't when I was watching it. Because instantly, they pull her out of her cell, and then she's taking charge and bossing everyone else around. She's the one saying, oh my gosh, what do you mean? You guys came in here to get me and you didn't have a plan for getting out? What is wrong with you? She's the one who says, give me the gun. I am going to get us out of here. She starts making the plan as she goes, and she's the one bossing everyone else around, not because they're male and she's female and it's some kind of, dominance issue or anything, but because they have no idea what they're doing. They're making it up by the seat of their pants as they go. And she's like, oh my gosh, you guys, you have to have some idea of what you're doing. So she has an idea of where to go and what to do, and they don't. And that's why she takes charge. Not because of any gender divide, just because she knows what she's doing and they don't really. And they let her. I mean, of course, Han sasses her about it and argues with her and everything. But again, that isn't so much because of the male-female thing, although that attraction is definitely there, but just because Han is a stubborn, pig-headed person, basically, who doesn't like being bossed around by anyone else. And I would say that, so from the very beginning, right there with Star Wars, they started this precedent of equality. Leia was important to the movie, not because she was the token girl on the cast, but because she had this whole story that was independent of everybody else, just like they each had their stories that were independent of hers. And then when they came together, that was what made the adventure going forward. And you see that continue in the next 2 movies. You start literally with her in the second movie. She's giving orders. She's a general. She's spending a lot of time in the communications center of this rebel bunker. She's directing the evacuation. She's the one who briefs the pilots on their missions. And it's hilarious from a visual perspective because she's not a very tall woman. She's a short woman. So you see this group of pilots, male pilots for the most part, and there's this short woman walking around inside briefing them, and it's hilariously funny. So the princess from the first movie has become the general now, or the important rebel commander, and her storyline in the second movie has nothing to do with her being a princess and everything to do with who she is to the rebellion. And then, of course, you know, she winds up separated from most of her companions and off with Han Solo on this adventure by chance, and how that ties into the bigger arc of the Empire and the rebellion and everything. But it still carries through to the third movie because she is sexualized at one point in the third movie. But what is interesting is how it's done. First of all, when she goes in to rescue the hero, our first scene with her, we get this reversal of roles in traditional fiction. She's the one rescuing the hero, not him rescuing her. So she comes in to rescue him, and she's not dressed in some kind of seductive costume. She doesn't try to do it through seduction or through womanly wiles or anything. She's actually dressed in this somewhat shapeless bounty hunter costume. And the plan that they've concocted is this bounty hunter mission where she gets in and she threatens people. And then once it's revealed that she's a female, the villain of that first section is like, oh, I want her as a pet, because he has a habit of taking beautiful women as pets, basically. But then she kills him. Again, spoilers, guys, but literally within the first 15 minutes of the movie, it's like, yep, we're going to sexualize her, but it's not going to be the way you think it's going to be. And by the way, she's going to kill him. And then they get out and get back home, and they get back to work fighting the war. There's not some massive storyline of, oh, as a woman, she was just so fragile and she underwent this experience and now she has to have all of this time to recover. She's like, no, you know, got out of there, and now let's just get back to work. And you immediately go into a Rebel Alliance briefing that once again puts women at front and center. The main rebel commander is a woman. So she stands there, and for her 30 seconds of Star Wars fame, as the actress called it, she gives the overview of what they're going to be doing in this big attack that takes up the like 2/3 of the movie, or the second half of the movie, or whatever. So it's a woman who steps forward and she says, here's what we're going to be doing. Here's the broad overall view. And then she hands it over to her sub-commanders, the commanders under her, who have figured out specific parts of the attack. So everybody has their specialty. This general planned this part, this general planned this part, this general planned this part. She's in charge of all of it and making sure that they do their parts, and then they get to deal with the details so that the labor is shared. And you can make an argument that the casting of the trilogy was heavily male-centric, and it was. You don't really see many female pilots. But as you're watching the story, you don't get the sense that it's a male-dominated club with a few token females, which is what you often get even in movies today, where you go into it and it's like, oh, well, that was just the token female. And then you see this reaction to that in a lot of female-dominated movies where it's like, well, you have your boys' club with your token female. We're going to have our girls' club with our token male. But neither side is actually showing any kind of equality, because it's all more men versus women kind of a thing. And Star Wars didn't do that. When you watch this story, you don't get the sense that it is this male-dominated club with a few female members. You get the sense that all of them have this rich and vibrant story behind them. And that carries over somewhat to the other Star Wars movies too, particularly in the sequel trilogy, the middle movie of that, The Last Jedi. You see Leia, now the commander of the entire resistance. So the position that a woman held in the last movie of the original trilogy. And you see women all through this movie. Both your ex-stormtrooper and the mechanic, the female mechanic, get a storyline. Your hotshot pilot does get slapped down by two female commanders, but not because he's male and they're female. He gets slapped down by the commanders because militarily he's wrong. And I could give you an hour-long discussion on military protocol and strategy, but, you know, the point is, The Last Jedi is one of the most feminist movies I have ever seen because it doesn't ask the gender question. Most of the Star Wars movies don't. They just create characters. Male or female, they all equally matter. In The Last Jedi, there's a female resistance officer who helps Poe mutiny, not because she's a girl and she's in love with him, but because she believes the same way he does. And a woman arguably gets the greatest line in the entire saga in that movie when she says, "This is how we win. Not fighting what we hate, but saving what we love," which I feel like is a powerful feminist message as well as just a good message, period. Because sometimes it's about fighting, and other times it's just about protecting what you love. So I would say what makes a successful female, feminist story is when people can say, that was a good character, without saying, well, that was a good female character or that was a good male character. When equality is portrayed as something people don't even think about. Is that the way that our world works right now? No, it is not. Mm-hmm. It should, but it doesn't. But as writers, we get to do something about that. As writers, we get to say, this is how it could be. And anyone who thinks stories don't have this massive effect on culture isn't paying attention. Hollywood's been brainwashing an entire culture for 100 years. So, I mean, it's true. And just look at the massive popularity of Tolkien's books, which weren't even published until, the 1960s?
Mm-hmm, yeah. And
just look at the huge 90% of all epic fantasy is still very Tolkien-esque, whether written by men or written by women. So I would say, yes, what makes a successful feminine, female, feminist story is just equality, being portrayed as a normal thing, something people don't even think about.
Yeah. So this was a wonderful lecture on the feminism in literature and in film. I have to applaud you. That was great, more than I expected. Wonderful. So we have a lot of ideas to think about. And also it brought me to compare what you said, that the strong female hero should be like not just a stubborn woman or who bosses everyone around, but really you have to have this deeper message behind her behavior and the purpose of her storyline in the book, which is independent of her identity as a woman. And many readers and many also writers do get this wrong, that if they present a female as a leading hero, that they think that it's a good feminist story, like the Hunger Games. Basically, yeah, everybody celebrates Katniss, but if you think about it deeply, she doesn't really know what her purpose is. She's confused and lost in all her own emotions and in what's going on in the world, and she's basically misused either by the district leader, who was also female, but she was working for her own evil purposes. So in the end, we realized that she's not maybe that good example for women. But I would like to contrast it with Hermione in the Harry Potter series, where she's always the brainy one, the one who thinks out all the ideas and how to help the company. So she's more stronger female hero than Katniss.
Yeah, and I would say I personally hate the term strong female character because I feel like it's hugely misleading. Because, like you said, people think that you make a kick-ass female character and that's what makes a strong female character. And ironically, no, that's actually just saying, okay, here's what cultural perception says makes a strong male character. So we just have to translate that to females, and that's what makes a strong female character. And it's not true. Mm-hmm. And I think instead of pushing to write strong female characters, we should be focusing on writing good female characters. For me, what makes a strong hero, male or female, is honesty. It's the willingness to face your past, no matter how ugly it is, and learn from it, to grow from it. It's a character being authentic. Not every character is going to be the kind who's like, okay, I'll pick up a sword and I'll fight like that. My sister, my younger sister, I am. Like, I was born the kind of person who becomes a general. I'm the strategist type. You know, you'd give me a problem and I'm going to give you 5 different potential solutions, and I'm going to tell you why each of them, what the advantages and disadvantages of each are, which ones I would suggest and why, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm the kind of person who says, this is a battle we need to fight. Here are the best people for these jobs in fighting this battle. My sister, when we would joke about, oh, I'll lead a rebellion or whatever, she's like, I am not joining any battle ever. You know what? If I can be the nurse or the cook or something like that, fine. But I'm not going to join the battle because she knows she can't handle battle. She can't kill people. I could, but she can't, you know? And so I think instead of pushing to write strong female characters, the better thing to do is to focus on writing good characters, well-written characters, both male and female. And that is how we make a change in the world. Not by saying, you have your male characters, we're going to create counterpart female characters, but just by saying, this is what strong people of any gender look like.
Yeah. So what tips, or who are your favorite female writers or favorite book heroines?
Oh, that is a tough question. Jane Austen is a queen. I will fight anyone who says otherwise. Mm-hmm. That woman was incredible, and her satires have stood for 200 years for a good reason. She was just amazing as a writer. So definitely Jane Austen. I enjoy a lot of British female classics writers. Gaskell's good. I don't love everything she's written. In fact, I would probably say I really only love one of her books, but I enjoyed reading most of hers. Cranford was kind of boring, but Wives and Daughters was fun. I love North and South. The Bronte sisters, I liked Jane Eyre a lot. I reread it a few times. Baroness Orczy, who wrote the Scarlet Pimpernel series. I love the Scarlet Pimpernel series. Georgette Heyer. So she's like the only romance writer I ever voluntarily read, which is funny for someone who spends 85% of her days reading romance for editing and everything. But Georgette Heyer is about the only romance writer I voluntarily read because she was incredible with writing characters. Some more modern names, Diana Wynne Jones. She's dead now, but I haven't read a Diana Wynne Jones book I didn't like. They were great. Megan Whalen Turner. I enjoyed Megan Whalen Turner's books. Maggie Stiefvater's books. I don't tend to like a lot of YA fantasy. I mean, anybody who is friends with me on Facebook knows this. I just, it's not my thing, because I feel like because of the problems in the traditional publishing world, a lot of the YA fantasy that gets published is just lame, in my personal opinion. And I'm kind of picky about that. But there are some really, really good female writers in the indie publishing world that I will recommend to pretty much anyone and everyone. My personal squad, Jennifer Freitag, who wrote, like, if you like Tolkien-esque fantasy, but you want it more mixed with a Rosemary Sutcliffe vibe, Sutcliffe was great, then read Jennifer Freitag's Plenilune. That is so good. Morgan Ferris's Chalam Fairy Tales is more of a Hebrew-inspired epic fantasy. That's really good. My editor, Emma Savant, writes some fantastic contemporary fantasy and urban fantasy fairy tale kind of stuff. That's really good. My writing partner, Miriam Neal, does so many genres just amazingly, between urban fantasy, one of the most original urban fantasies I've ever read, and I love urban fantasy, to light fairy tale fantasy with her book Paper Crowns, to there's one coming out next month from her. It's actually, I'm finishing the editing on today. That is basically futuristic samurai Robin Hood. And it has one of my favorite female characters in it. So Yeah, the list, it gets kind of long, and I should probably write it up and post it on my website as a reference. I don't tend to love a lot of female characters in fiction as much, but I love several female writers. Mm-hmm. So, J.K. Rowling's kind of complicated. So I will preface this by saying this has nothing to do with her as a person or her latest beliefs or the controversy surrounding that. As a writer, J.K. Rowling is good, but she's not amazing. I enjoy Harry Potter, but ironically, I feel like J.K. Rowling gets an awful lot of credit for something that she stumbled into by chance. You mentioned earlier that she went through so many rejections before a publisher finally took a chance on her books. And that chance that publisher took put her at the forefront of the changing face of middle grade literature and children's literature. And a lot of people now think that she was at the forefront of it because she's a good writer or an amazing writer. And that's not true. She's a good writer. She's not really an amazing writer from a critical perspective. But the reason her name stands out is because that publisher took a chance on her. Because for years, I'm a 90s kid, so I grew up in a world that didn't have a lot of really good middle grade literature except for the historical fiction stuff that Scholastic Fiction was putting out. And kids had been clamoring for better fiction, middle grade, what we now call middle grade fiction. For years, they had been clamoring for this, you know. They wanted books that were good, that they enjoyed, and weren't just basically dime novel fiction. And Rowling, the publisher who finally took a chance on Rowling, I think he did so because his granddaughter read the proof of Harry Potter, or the manuscript or something like that, and said, Grandpa, you need to publish this. Kids are going to love this. And so he took a chance on it. And Harry Potter started selling like hotcakes, not because Rowling was amazing, but because this was the kind of fiction kids had been wanting for years. And because one publisher finally listened to a child and published this kind of thing, took a chance, took a risk, the entire face of children's literature has been changed for the last 20 years.
Curiously, Tolkien's Hobbit got published because of a recommendation of a child, of the publisher's son. And yeah, so basically, maybe both Tolkien and both Rowling, they just filled up the hole that was there in the market at the time when they came up with their writing.
Yes. And honestly, I think that says traditional publishers should listen to children more.
Yeah. Or generally to the readers, to what the readers want and not what they think the readers want.
Exactly.
What's made me interesting in your comments is you always mentioned your reading partner. How does this partnership work? Is it like you have a support group, or you have something like you challenge each other to writing? That's interesting concept.
Yeah, it really is. I jokingly call it my wolf pack. My werewolf pack, and I'm the alpha. But basically, my best friend and I do challenge each other to write a lot. This month is National Novel Writing Month, so there have been word wars where we race each other against the clock for a certain amount of time to see who gets more words in. We brainstorm together pretty much every major scene in our books, or just the plots of our books get brainstormed with each other before they get written. And that some of that is true for the rest of my squad too, for the rest of my pack. I talk over the plot developments with them. I give them feedback. They give me feedback. It's a critique group is what it is, but it isn't one that started out as a critique group. It grew out of a group of friends.
So you're the Inklings of nowadays.
Yeah. My version of the Inklings.
Yeah.
And I'm the Tolkien, and my best friend's the Lewis, although hilariously, I have the same personality type as Lewis does, and her personality type is not. But yes, I'm the Tolkien in terms of what I write, and she's the Lewis, and we have the others. Mm-hmm. There's one guy, and about 3 other girls. So yeah, it's our version of the Inklings, basically.
Do you have like regular meetings like the Inklings did?
No, that would be fun, but we don't really work very well that way. We're all very introverted, very independent.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like my best friend and I have our regular sessions. Like we talk every day, we write most days. And then there's two of the other girls and I are in a group chat and we discuss writing there or paste snippets there or do a war there. One of the other girls and I frequently war late at night because she's an hour behind me and like we're both toward the West Coast. So everybody else on the East Coast is going to bed, but we're still up. So it's more like a one-on-one thing, me with the individual ones of them.
Yeah, so like people, if you need help in a particular area, you have a person to go to discuss it.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Another thing that was interesting in what you were talking is that you don't really like 80% of the fantasy or what you said that you did, that you're not really a big fan of it. So you differentiate your leisure reading and your work reading, yeah?
Oh, yes, definitely. The vast majority of what I edit, I would not pick up for leisure writing or leisure reading. It's just not my kind of thing. In leisure reading, I tend to read a very wide variety, but I also, the favorites that emerge from that tend to be something that have a little unusual tone. Mm-hmm. So the books that I love tend to be things like my writing squad writes, because they're books not really found in publishing today. I do read a lot of indie fiction just to test it out or because I like the author. I've read so many books because I liked the author as a person, not just like not even necessarily as a writer, but I was curious. So I read it. Curiosity is a huge driving force in what I read. But in general, the things that I gravitate towards in leisure reading are not the things that I edit.
You have to force yourself into reading it.
Yeah.
Do you sometimes have to force yourself into reading it as it is your work?
I do, actually. There are days I get up and I'm like, I do not want to read another Hallmark-style contemporary romance today. I don't want to do it. I'm like, you know what? I have a deadline next week. If I don't do it today, I'm going to be late for my deadline. So I'm going to make myself read this.
Yeah. Mom is the inspiration.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, in that regard, my job is no different from anyone else's. There are days I do not want to go to work. You know, even I don't have to get up and go anywhere outside my home. I work from home. That's a huge advantage. I love that I can work from anywhere in the world that I have Wi-Fi and electricity. Yeah. And I can work from anywhere in the world. I can work from a coffee shop down the road. I can work from here. I can go to my friend's house in Washington and work from there. But like everyone else, I have bad days. I have days that just don't go well. I have a book on my desk that I can't really figure out what I'm doing with it because I'm a little confused. Or I have a book on my desk that I don't want to edit that day, you know. Or I have a week of bad days where it's like, oh my gosh, I'm so tired, but I have to do this work because it's my job. I have deadlines. I have clients who are expecting these books back, you know. So in that respect, it's the same as any other job. I've got good days and I've got bad days.
We've all been there at one point. Mm-hmm. And how much do you read in your leisure time?
Not as much as I would like to. But I usually manage, when I'm regularly reading, I usually manage 5 or 6 books a month. If I've got some extra time or if they're short books, I can do as many as 12, 13, 14 books a month. I'm a fast reader. I'm a speed reader. So that definitely makes a difference.
And when you count your work in, so it makes much more?
Oh, yes. Yes. I edit between 5 and 12 books a month. So, yeah.
So you get to read a lot of texts.
Yes. Yes.
It must be quite exhausting at some point.
It is sometimes where I'll be like, okay, you know what? Work is over. I'm just going to put a movie on. Do nothing. Or I'm going to go for a long walk because that really helps. Or I'm just going to go do nothing for 5 minutes.
Okay, so maybe what would be some last advice that you would give to future writers? Who knows, maybe some of our listeners nowadays or today may become future writers. One never knows. So what advice would you give?
First of all, I would say take risks. Write what you love. One of the reasons that my book went so fast last year and that I'm still heavily invested in this series is because it's all about things that I love. I love Star Wars, most of it. We won't get into the ones I don't like right now. I loved Greek mythology growing up. I still find some of it fascinating. Definitely fascinating enough to write about. I love rebellions. I was born a rebel. One of those, you know. My personal motto is know the rules so that you can break them effectively. Because some rules shouldn't be broken, but some should. And as long as you know, then you can figure out which ones should and shouldn't be. So there was so much in this series that I loved. And that's one reason that it went so fast, because I was writing what I loved. And if you read the writing greats, advice from the writing greats, Ray Bradbury, for example, he says, and this is actually from 2 or 3 different things that he said. Basically, he says, fall in love every day for the rest of your life. And out of that love, create a world. So write about what you love, what you really, really love. That's my first piece of advice. My second is to take risks, so you see that people aren't really writing that and you love it and you want to write about it, do it. You might get published, you might not, but write it for sure. And my third piece of advice is to be willing to take criticism. If you actually want to be a serious writer, if you want to be a serious author, you have to be willing to take criticism. Don't get so personally wrapped up in your book that you cannot accept healthy, constructive criticism, or you're never going to be able to publish it. Or if you do publish it, it's never going to be very good, because you haven't taken the time to make sure that objectively it's a good story, as well as personally it's a story that you loved. The book I'm writing at the moment, book 2, is off to a rough start. There are going to be scenes that I come back later and I go, this is better than I thought it was. But it's kind of off to a rough start. My writing buddy has said more than once, there's something in this scene I would suggest just changing or tweaking or whatever, because it's not really coming through. And I've been writing seriously for 8 years. So, sometimes you still get rough months. It's been an extremely stressful month for me. So that makes writing a little bit harder. I would say definitely the third piece is to be willing to take that constructive criticism. It's probably going to take you a while to find the kind of people who can give you good constructive criticism, who can point out what you did well and what you need to improve. I mean, it took me, 4 or 5 years to get there. There were beta readers early on that just basically tried to tell me how to write my book. And I was like, ooh, no, that's not how this works. Nope. Mm-hmm. But those would be my top 3 pieces. Write what you love, be willing to take risks, and don't get so personally wrapped up in your book that you can't accept healthy, constructive criticism.
Okay. So thank you for the advice. I don't have any more answers for you. So maybe we can now make place for our students. If you have any questions, you can write them either to the chat or you can ask them directly.
Hello. I would like to ask one question. Before, about the self-publishing, you've been mentioning mostly only about the advantages of it comparing to traditional publishing, but what about disadvantages of self-publishing?
They definitely exist. So I would say the biggest disadvantage is that you have to pay for everything out of pocket. So your cover design, your editing, your formatting, if you can't format it yourself, and then, of course, your upload fees. The site that I use charges a $50 upload fee for every print book. If you're just publishing ebooks, you can go the free route for that, but you still have to pay for ISBNs, and those can get pretty expensive. So like I said earlier, it can be usually $1,000 is what you can expect to pay, somewhere in that vicinity, for self-publishing a book. And that is probably your biggest disadvantage right up front, because you have to pay for all of that. Nobody else is paying for it. If you're traditionally publishing, your publisher pays for all of that. They get a say in it and you don't, whereas in self-publishing, you get a say in it, but they're paying for it. And in self-publishing, you're paying for it. The second biggest disadvantage is marketing. Traditional publishers have a marketing base that you don't have as a self-publisher. They can get your book into bookstores. They have marketing teams that take your book, your story, and they start pushing it in online markets, in brick and mortar markets, actual physical stores and stuff like that. And you don't have that as a self-published person. You have to market yourself. You have to figure out what it is about your book that is going to attract readers, and then you have to push that. You have to usually be active on at least one social media in order to start getting the word out about your books. A lot of author advice says you should be active on all social medias. I don't happen to agree with that because, I'm sorry, I, as an introvert, do not have the sanity level as somebody who works full-time and an introvert and a writer on the side. I don't have the sanity level to cope with being on all the social medias at once and promoting my book on all of them at once. But for some people, it does work. So I would say that's the second disadvantage. The third is it takes so much longer to get your name out there usually. That there are sometimes shortcuts to that. Like if you're in a Facebook group that is genre specific, then it doesn't take as long to get started. Or if you're writing a popular genre, like a right to market genre, like contemporary romance or paranormal romance, and if you work your advertising right, then it might not take you as long to get noticed. But definitely it's going to take you longer. Now, interestingly, that's not as true in the world of traditional publishing anymore, that they will take care of getting you noticed and getting you marketed. I know someone who was an indie author, is an indie author, and one of her book series was picked up by HarperCollins for publishing. Her name is Intisar Kanani, and you should totally read her books because she's fantastic and writes great YA, epic fantasy, fairy tale retellings. Her book Thorn came out in March. And as a new author, HarperCollins, and especially coming out right as quarantine started, HarperCollins didn't really do a lot to promote her, which is frustrating because they almost didn't do a whole lot more than indie authors can do on their own. So that was really tough. She does have a second book coming out next summer, I think. But the gap between what traditional publishers can do as far as marketing and what indie publishers can do as far as marketing is actually narrowing. So that's not as much of a disadvantage anymore. But I would say a few smaller disadvantages are figuring out things like cover design, where what's going to sell your book, but also what's a good cover for your book. There are a lot of bad indie published covers. Oh my gosh, a lot. And that harms your book as well as your reputation as an author. Also, getting a good editor can be a really tough thing. A lot of people struggle to find a good editor who works well with them. So that's another disadvantage. But I would say that's almost an advantage too, because the flip side of that is that you get a say in your editor. And in traditional publishing, you don't always. You just have to accept whatever editor the publishing house provides. So that's one of those things that can go either way, just like cover design. Whereas with an indie author, you get to choose who designs your cover and all of that kind of thing, but you might not be able to afford the good ones, whereas the traditional publishing house can afford the good ones, but you don't get a say in it, usually. So I would say a lot of the disadvantages to indie publishing can kind of go either way. But definitely the biggest ones are that it takes a lot more time, a lot more energy, and a lot more money to self-publish.
Okay, thank you. So we have 4 more questions in the chat here. Petra is asking, is some of your inspiration coming from your dreams?
In general, no. Fun fact, I do not enjoy dreaming. I am one of those people who's like, if I have dreamed, it wasn't a good night. Technically, if you're dreaming, you're in REM sleep, right? So it's a good thing because you're deeper sleep, all that kind of thing. But if I wake up in the morning and I'm remembering dreams, in general, I'm like, oh my gosh, that was not a good night, because I don't really enjoy dreaming, which is a weird fact.
Yeah, that really is weird. That's the first time I ever heard about it.
Yeah, I'm not a big dream person. There have been a couple pieces of things probably when I first started writing that were like, yeah, I think that came out of a dream somewhere, more in atmosphere than in any specific happenings, because my dreams just tend to be weird because a lot of them are fueled by stress, and that just makes for weird dreams. It just does.
Yeah. Okay, Maria's asking, what material do you edit? Only fiction, or what are the most irritating mistakes authors make?
I edit fiction and nonfiction. So I edit for Martina, so I edit scholarly papers. I've also edited, what else have I edited that's nonfiction? I've edited a few memoir kind of things. I was approached to edit a cookbook a couple months ago, but my schedule was too full, so I had to turn it down. What else have I edited that's I've edited newsletters and blog posts before. And I'm the main editor for a fairy tale blog. So I will look over some of those posts before they get published and just make sure they all are coming together pretty nicely. But yeah, primarily, I would say probably 90% of what I edit or 95% of what I edit is fiction. And what are some of the most irritating mistakes authors make? Oh gosh, I feel like I have a really long list, but every time I think about it, I can't think of anything. One thing that drives me nuts is when they put M-dashes in literally everywhere. Like, instead of mixing commas, semicolons, colons, and M-dashes, they use maybe 50% commas and 50% M-dashes, and colons and semicolons apparently don't exist anymore. So that's kind of like, no. Okay, I know you can't really use colons and semicolons extensively in fiction, but they have a place, and this is it. So we got to work on this. Another thing is probably when they don't really check to make sure that their character names are spelled consistently in fantasy. Where I'm just kind of sitting here like, okay, there's a difference between making a typographical error and just not checking to make sure that your character name is consistent. And that one kind of drives me nuts. I would say in general, just when an author doesn't think they need to pay attention to grammar rules or punctuation rules, that their editor will take care of all of that. And that's not our job. Our job is to take what you've done and give it the final polish. Our job is to bring minor rules that most people can't remember, or maybe even are difficult to find for the average person. Even if you do a Google search, it's kind of like, well, this is a really obscure rule and it doesn't really show up on a Google search. And as an editor, I've run into that, when I'm trying to check a minor rule. So that's something we bring. And it really annoys me when an author acts like, here, I can just give you this utter, total mess and you're going to fix it for me. No, I'm not. That's not my job.
Yeah. When you mentioned the inconsistency in names, it's surprising that nowadays when people are working on computers, you can easily change all the names by one click. That maybe in the past when people used to write by hand, so it was maybe more common that when you decided to change the name halfway through the story, but nowadays that's really surprising.
Yeah. which I think is why it's so irritating to me, because it is so simple. You do a search and replace, bingo, done.
Yeah. Do you edit a lot of people who are not native English speakers?
Not a lot, but I think I've worked with more than most American editors tend to. Indie editors being the difference. I've worked with people from Slovakia, from Italy, France, Brazil, I think I've worked with someone from Mexico, someone from South Africa. I want to say I'm forgetting a few, but I have worked with enough that I really enjoy it, especially because they bring a different perspective to the world of English writing. Like, they will phrase something that is grammatically correct, but that no native English speaker would ever phrase like that, because culturally we just don't use those speech patterns, but it's grammatically correct. And I love that. I love coming across that as an editor. It's also fun. I have several clients in both the United Kingdom and Australia. So it's fun working with them because that's a bit different from American English. So I would say probably 40% of my client base is international, which I love.
Mm-hmm. A huge diversity. And is it mostly fiction papers or also non-fiction papers from these international clients? It's
mostly fiction. Mm-hmm. Especially contemporary romance, because that is such a huge market genre. So a lot of people write to that. And one reason they'll come to an American editor is because the vast majority of the audience for that genre is American. And this doesn't bother me. As an American reader, I have no problem reading a book that an Australian author wrote and just looking up the Australian terms if I don't already know what they mean, or if there's a glossary or something like that. I don't have a problem with that. A lot of American readers do. I've never really understood that myself, but they do. Mm-hmm. So a lot of international writers who are writing to the contemporary fiction American market, because that is probably 80%, maybe 75 to 80% of the audience for that genre is American. They will come to an American editor and ask for editing from them so that the book is actually edited in American English, and you weed out like the Australian terms, which is probably most of my Australian clients are romance writers who come to me because I can go through and bring it up to American English standard and take out the Australian terms and take out the Australian spellings and that kind of thing. So it's kind of like I'm trying to publish in your world, so give me your eyes on that. So it's mostly fiction.
Mm-hmm. Okay, another question is from Veronica. She's asking, are there any choices that you made that you regret, or on the other hand, what really pushes you to get the better in your life?
Most of the choices I've made that I regret were as a teenager. I think we all do some really stupid stuff as teenagers. Yeah. And I was no exception. I did some really stupid stuff as a teenager. In business, not really. I would say the one thing I might do differently is probably the thing I would do differently in most of my life is give myself more grace. I'm an extremely critical person of myself. It's true what they say, you are your harshest critic. And I hold myself to an impossibly high standard sometimes. And as somebody who deals with a depressive disorder, that doesn't help. I have what's known as persistent depressive disorder. So I deal with low levels of depression regularly. And they often become higher levels of depression, not because of anything I've done. It's just that's the way the disorder works. And that makes it even harder to remember to give myself grace, that it's okay to stumble and fall down as long as you get back up again. That it's okay to have a bad day, that you don't have to force yourself to be okay all the time.
Yeah.
That it's okay to not be okay sometimes, as long as you don't let it become an excuse. And that, I would say, is probably the hardest thing that I've had to deal with, because I have lived with a lot of people who allowed their disorders or their unique personal struggles to become an excuse. And the instant that you allow that to become an excuse, you're not pushing yourself to be better. Mm-hmm. And I've tended to swing too far in the opposite direction and don't give myself enough grace to just be human.
Yeah.
So I would say that's just being better and being human and getting up again when I fall is one of the biggest lessons that I'm still learning in my life.
I think
that's what pushes me to be better. It's just, I want that. I want to be a better person.
Yes. I think that's the problem of the general attitude of the society, because they are pushing you to be perfect, to never show your mistakes, never show your failures, and it starts with the education system, so it's much more complex problem for everyone. Just the other day I was actually reading the backstory about Scatman Joe, the singer, that when he was a child, he had a big problem with stuttering, and he turned it into his greatest gift, actually, that he made a career on doing this kind of songs. So he can be a very inspiring person to others. Another question we have from Zuzana. Zuzana is asking, you mentioned that you write for some years, but this is your first book published. What convinced you to get this one published, and why didn't you publish your older works?
Because if I had published my older works, well, let's just say that some of them are never going to see the light of day. It's funny because I've worked with a lot of writers who've said that they felt called to be a writer, called by God or called by an event in their life. And that's wonderful. That's amazing. I support that. But some of those writers think that because they've been called, that automatically makes them good at something. And that's not true. Every single thing that we do is a journey. Life itself is a journey. And the smaller things along the way are also journeys. Our careers are a journey. You don't start a career and you're immediately good at it. I mean, unless you're superhuman, which I'm not. So it's a journey. And I did not start out being amazing at writing. I mean, my first major work, like a lot of young writers, was basically a Tolkien ripoff. You know, it was more Arthurian legend style, but it still had all the Tolkien hallmarks. And that is never going to see the light of day because it was not a very well-written series. So the reason I didn't publish older books is because I knew they just weren't good enough. And it's a really fine line, especially in self-publishing, because you're not, I would say especially in self-publishing because you're the one figuring the line out, but also I have seen an awful lot of rubbish traditionally published books. So I don't know that being accepted by a traditional publishing house actually gives you any more credit for being a good writer than just self-publishing and figuring out that line for yourself. But this book just sang in a way that most of my earlier books didn't, at least not without heavy revisions. Probably, let's see, I've been seriously writing since 2013 or 2012, somewhere in there. And the book that I wrote for Nano in 2013 hasn't been published. It was the first completed adult novel that I wrote, and it's actually more YA than it is adult, but it'll probably get published someday, but not without super, super heavy revisions. I've rewritten it like 6 times already, and it's still not ready. The book that I wrote in 2016 will be split into a trilogy or a tetralogy, 4 books, probably next year and published with heavy revisions. The book that I wrote in 2018 will probably be published at some point, but again, it needs heavy revisions. it's just an instinct, a bit. One that I learned, so to speak, or learned to listen to as an editor first. So I can look at my books with that editing eye and go, oh, no, that is not ready. That is not ready at all. And last year it was like it all came together. I wrote the book. The book was good, even in raw draft form. It was one of the cleanest first drafts I'd ever written. I was like, I'm a Christian, so it was kind of like God was like, yep, okay, here we go. Finally.
You are enlightened.
Yes. And I knew I made myself wait until after I'd finished it. And I made myself wait another week before deciding, yes, this is going to be the book I first publish, because this is me putting my best foot forward. It's not the best book I'm ever going to write, because hopefully I'll keep improving as the years go on. So it's not the best book I'm ever going to write. There are typos that slipped through, and there's a formatting error I actually have to go fix this week. But this is my best foot forward at this point in my life, and I feel like it's finally time.
Good. So good luck for your future publishing. And are there any more questions from our students? This is the last chance to ask. Okay, so apparently no more questions. So I thank you very much for doing this interview with us, for talking to us. You presented a lot of interesting ideas, a lot to think about. It's been a very fruitful interview, and I'm happy that you made it here.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for listening, for the incredible questions. It has been a really good time, and I have thoroughly enjoyed it. So thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, bye.
Have a good day, or night for all of you.
Yes, almost night. It's 6:30, so.
Right. I'm just going to start my day, so that's editing, and I should probably finish eating breakfast.
Good luck with that. Okay, bye.
Right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.